Hello there. I am Sarang Deshpande, Senior Solutions Consultant at Tracelink. Welcome to another episode of Orchestrating Outcomes for External Manufacturing, brought to you by Tracelink. We will continue to focus on brand owners' perspective on supply chain digitalization, and more importantly, will be focusing this time around on a perspective of a clinical phase organization. And I'm excited to have with me here today Colby Wolfe, Executive Director and Head of Global Supply Chain at Dyne Therapeutics, a clinical phase organization. I have known Colby for about 9 years now, and we work together on variety of supply chain optimization projects at Sandoz. I mean, they were mostly focusing on end-to-end planning, site performance. Uh, what I always remember was Colby used to have amazing stories from his visits to the sites, and all the insights were were very interesting to understand what are the various challenges and opportunities we have within our manufacturing processes also. So, I mean, without any further ado, I'll pass it on to Colby, and maybe Colby, you can give us a little bit about your background and your current responsibilities before we hit the ground.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me here, Sarang. It's definitely great to talk to you again. I know we worked on a lot of things as you highlighted, and it was always interesting, and the digital perspective was always something that you brought to Sandoz and then to Novartis as well when we both transitioned to that. So just to kind of highlight a little bit about my background, I'll start with the most recent role. I have here at Dyne Therapeutics. So I am the executive director and head of global supply chain. So what does that really mean? We are a clinical stage company, so I'm in charge of the clinical supply chain, the build of the commercial supply chain, distribution, logistics, planning, demand forecasting, everything farther upstream, multi-echelon planning, that type of thing, end-to-end planning. So really, it runs the whole gambit here. As we prepare ourselves. I joined when we were a research and development company. We went on to a clinical company, and then we wound up right now with some pretty fascinating clinical data. That we think can really change the lives of patients. So we're looking forward to driving to commercialization in that. Prior to Dyne, I was with Moderna for a few years. Actually, I joined during the pandemic. I led their production and commercial supply chain planning for the world, essentially in the very beginning when I joined. As the company began to grow and we began to formalize our supply chain, some things broke off. So European supply chain broke off. We started to separate drug substance versus drug product planning. That began to split off. But essentially, when we were looking at it, it's not only the COVID-19 vaccine, but the 32 other clinical programs that they had running at the time, the manufacturing of that, all the internal component manufacturing, so the buffers and things of the like. We were responsible. My team was responsible for planning that. Prior to Moderna, I spent probably about 6 years at Novartis and Sandoz, right? So I started at Sandoz and morphed into a role in Novartis in the parent company, similar to yours. Sorry. So my time at Novartis actually towards the end was more along the lines of end-to-end planning. So my responsibility was bottleneck management, end-to-end planning for a network of sites. So I had 8 sites. Most of them were geolocated, most in the U.S., but I also took on some of the stragglers, as I like to call them. So the special technologies. So that was inhalation aerosols, patch technology, aseptics. I did end-to-end for the external supply organization. Aseptics. So really, it ran the gambit. So when you think of really the modalities that you can have, whether it's biologics, it's aseptics, it's OSD, liquid creams and ointments. I touched basically all of those in my time there. Prior to that, I was at Bristol Myers for about 2 years. And when I was there, I was a supply chain product lead for end-to-end planning. And with that, it was oncology and it was immunology. So, a couple of my products, Sprycel was one, which was an oncology product, oral solid dose. And then I also had atazanavir, which was for the indication of HIV. And then additionally on top of that, I was working in drug product. I was responsible for the site in Anani, Italy, and the drug product production that took place there. Part of that also was digitization, and the project that we had when we were going from an ERP system to more of a planning specific system. When you're looking at scenario planning and the likes of Kinaxis essentially is what we were implementing there. Before that, I was at Teva, and really I started my career at Teva. I spent overall 15 total years. A little bit more within supply chain, and it all started at Teva. So I think I spent about 5 years at Teva. I started in master data management. I ended in planning when I decided to leave and go to Bristol Myers for other experiences. And really, if you look at that scope and that span of time, within supply chain, it's always been, what haven't I done? What could I do, and how can I kind of broaden my toolbox to get where I needed to be? So starting in Teva, I was doing master data, and I started in planning. I started to say, okay, well, I don't really have a global view. I'm more local. So let me go get a global view. And I went to Bristol Myers and did that with a branded perspective as well. And then moving on throughout my career, and here I am, handling the supply chain for a clinical phase company. So it's always been a little bit different, and I've always looked at my roles, and what I've been doing is how can I grow and how can I expand on what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, because it just makes me a better leader. It makes me a better manager. It makes me just a better planner and a better supply chain professional.
Yeah. I mean, that's. Thank you for a very detailed introduction, Colby. And what I've realized is that you have probably had a very unique journey in a sense that you have been at a generic manufacturer, a branded manufacturer, and probably at a very tumultuous time when supply chain was probably going through its biggest challenges. And of course, you are now part of a clinical phase company also, and of course, you have worked across variety of product lines from oral solids to derm to injectables, and they also have their own supply chain challenges. So maybe can you summarize, or can you give me a high level overview of what supply chain digitalization means to you after having lived through this prism of scenarios? Would be good to know that to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I think really what it comes down to is, if you're looking at what stage of a company you are, right? You're starting from a base, and whatever that base is, there's two things that you really need, right? So you need visibility and you need efficiency. So those are the two things that really are the overarching things to make better decisions. Whether you want to be agile, whether you want to cut costs, whatever that is. So if we look at it through the spectrum, supply chain digitization just simply means doing our work better, doing our work more efficient, having more visibility, and having the ability to make better decisions using that information.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting, right? Because I mean, what I have been noticing is you hit the nail right when you said that we need visibility, and we are today in age of this massive explosion of AI and data. And what one of the things I've observed, at least very specific to the pharma industry, is when it comes to this visibility and data exchange, right? Status quo is one of the biggest challenges I've seen in most of the organizations. The inertia is very high. They have probably gotten too comfortable with this email exchange, PDF exchange, and spreadsheets, which seems to be working okay, but I'm pretty sure that's not what really is helping drive uh, real time visibility or efficiencies. What are your views on this in terms of why do you think the pharma industry is stuck, and what's happening there when the world is moving at a different pace altogether?
It's interesting you mentioned that. I think when you look at how pharma operates, right? So whether it's, and we can bring this back to generic pharma versus big pharma, right? You have the difference between commoditization
Mm-hmm.
and lower margins, and you need that efficiency to actually come out on top, right? So the leaders in the industry are more efficient. They manage their costs better. They manage their supply chains better. They understand, kind of going into it, that it's not necessarily, when you're looking at what is your differentiation strategy, right? It's cost. It's cost in generics. In branded, it's not that way, right? The pervasive thought is brands have like all this money to throw around and do whatever they want to do. But in reality, there's even more cost pressure there. So when you're going into it and you're looking at, kind of how those individual organizations operate, right? We're essentially looking to try and cut costs as much as possible. Compare that to a clinical organization, right? We don't normally, if you're a pure clinical play as it is right now and you have no commercial products, you don't have any revenue. So everything that you have is based off of what people have invested in you. So whether you've raised money, whether you've gone for IPO, whether you're leveraging debt, whatever that may be, however you're getting your funding to continue operations, right? That money is it's indispensable, right? And you have other priorities that you need to deal with.
Yep.
That aren't digitization, right? So you need efficiency, but you don't really have a huge market to go with. When you're talking a commoditized product, you have this enormous market and you have this splintering of the supply chain. So you need to be able to know real time where is your data, where is your product, where is your what are your on time and full, what are your KPIs, how are they impacting what you're doing. So you take all of that, right? It's in my mind, it's far easier to be able to digitize something from the start. So from a clinical company, the more you're able to digitize earlier, the easier it is to go forward, right? When you're a behemoth, when you're a Teva or you're a Novartis or you're a BMS, right? When you look at those, it's much harder to be able to get everybody on board. In a clinical organization, I got 10 people. I just need to get 10 people on board with me and we go, right? We're agile. We have this ability to move and shake with kind of the trends and what's happening. So when you ask, kind of what are the difficulties of doing this, number one, it's bringing people on board. And why haven't they done it? Because they have 100,000 employees in their tech ops organizations, right? And you have to bring all of those along. So if you take the normal pharma, in my mind, the normal pharma model is, you're buying companies. So when you're buying companies, you're also buying technology and you're buying legacy systems. You're not necessarily moving to change those over at any given time. It's a slow process. You're in a regulated industry, and it's not just one regulatory body, right? If you're just launching in the US and you're only in the US, it makes it much easier. But if you have to deal with EMA or you have to deal with anything in the Middle East, South America, Brazil, Japan, Asia, you have more problems because you're dealing with more of these regulatory bodies and agencies to be able to get this to happen. So you're piecemealing your digitization together. So the difficulty comes when you get to be too big. When you need digitization the most, it's the hardest to get, right? Because not only, you have the funds and you have the ability to do it, but you're so splintered in a way, based on just how the industry has worked, how you've grown, and how you do your business. That makes sense.
Makes sense. I mean, and you have quite a bit touched on very few on a very important points, which I was about to ask you a follow-up question on that. And partly you have covered that, but one key thing that you mentioned, right, that the sooner you start the journey of your supply chain digitalization in the lifeline of an organization, the better off you are, because the larger you grow, the bigger the inertia is. So then going back to to being a clinical phase organizations, where does supply chain digitalization fit in their overall strategy? Because as you rightly said, right, there are a lot of other competing priorities that you would have this commercialization also as a priority. Then you have R&D and clinical trials also as some of the key priorities that you would have. And with that limited budget, where does generally supply chain digitalization fit in for a clinical phase organization?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Only in the sense that it's just very difficult to do this in a clinical organization because supply chain isn't brought in until just near commercialization, right?
Right, right.
They're not normally brought in. Procurement's not normally brought in, right? You have these low volumes, and you're dealing on, really, it's more of a relationship basis with your CMOs. It's not transactional. So when you get to be bigger and you're dealing with some of your larger CMOs, and you're going back and forth based on price, you're going back and forth based on transactions. It's not relationship based necessarily. The initial contact and the initial relationship building might be, but when you're going the day to day, it's very much transactional, right? I issued you a PO, you delivered this, on time and full was this, and you either hit or didn't hit what you were supposed to do, right?
Right,
And
right.
same thing for the POs. Like, I didn't respond to you in 10 days because something else was happening. I didn't get you the PO in the amount of time that you expected. So it really becomes this transactional type of situation. When you're smaller and you're in clinic, and you're only clinical phase, yes, you're small, but you're dealing with relationships. You have the ability, you have the agility, you don't have the volume. And that's really where that comes. So you don't need a supply chain. You don't need someone running your supply chain. You don't need someone running procurement. You don't need, kind of this drag on your organization in a way. They're doing it with the technical experts. So you have the SMEs that are responsible for, really the science, and taking it from, what you would consider research and development into process validation, into commercialization, into GMP, or GMP, and then into commercialization. So those are the people that are running this process. So they're not necessarily thinking, how do I get my forecast to them the best way, right? That's all kept up here, and it's kept in their head. Nothing is memorialized, nothing is written down,
Yeah.
because it doesn't need to be. Because if you're making one or two batches, it's pretty easy to say, yeah, I'm going to make a batch in April and I'm going to make a batch in November, and that's going to be what it is. Now, when they do start bringing supply chain folks in, we start saying, oh my goodness, we need to do all of these things, right? The very first thing that we look at is, do we have an ERP, right? So what's our financial system? What's our system of record? How do we then take what we're doing and now start to generate forecasts? We get into commercial supply agreements. How do we start to handle binding windows, non-binding windows, things like that? And the business actually piece of the supply chain, the order to cash in a way. Even though you may not have sales yet, you have to kind of think of it that way. So how do we get the drug to where it needs to be in the time it needs to be there? So some of the challenges that I've had coming into Dyne is, there was no ERP, right? There was nothing. Again, everybody was working how they worked in the past in small pharma. It's if it's a 100 person company, I think I was actually employee 100. So if you're coming into that small of an organization, right, the CEO, the chief operating officer, the SMEs, you're all in a fairly condensed space, and you can have these conversations about what needs to happen and why it needs to happen. When you start moving towards a situation where you have two lead products, so we have two lead products that we're ready to really start moving on to phase 3 trials with, all of a sudden your volume starts to grow. And you're not able to keep track of that. As you go towards PPQs, whether it's in small pharma or big pharma or clinical stage companies, you're working on PPQs. Now, all of a sudden, you have to lot tag, you have to differentiate what batches can go where. If I'm only running in the US a trial, and now all of a sudden I decide to go to Europe, maybe I have label variants that I need to manage. So all of a sudden, what once was very easy because you have a couple batches here or there, now has become very difficult, and it's very fragmented. So typically when the supply chain professionals come in, it's at that stage. It's at the stage where things are, it's hitting the fan, and you have to try and figure it out and work through the challenges that are presented. You're not necessarily looking to roll towards KPIs and making sure that the suppliers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're delivering, and that's the key point, is they're delivering. So the digitization process, like I said, you come in, you create an ERP in Excel, right? Excel is a planner's favorite tool. It's supply chain professional's favorite tool. It's what we use for pretty much everything, scenario planning and the like. And there's very few tools that bridge the gap between, like a PPDS in SAP and Excel, right? And if you're a small company like Dyne or another clinical company, you're not necessarily looking to jump into PPDS. That's a huge cost drag on the company, right? You may have an ERP. It may be smaller, but it'll do the work that you need. If you're a public company, you're going to need SOX compliance. You're going to need financial controls and things like that. And it may not be, the SAPs of the world. You may end up with something that is not great for planning. It's great for finance, but it's not good for planning. And let's be honest, an ERP is just simply a financial tool that they've built onto, right? So I'm not going to go buy Kinaxis, for $1 million a year. I don't have that funding. But what I'm going to look for is something kind of in between. And most of those things in between are I call them mom and pop shops, where they've identified an issue. It's not a clean, sleek type of solution, but it helps you get there. And that's part of the journey, right? So you have to start somewhere. You start in Excel, and then you kind of piecemeal yourself towards where you're going. So that's in my mind how that begins.
Yeah. No, makes sense, right? And there were some very key aspects that you touched based on, which is about all your relationship with the CMOs and how they evolve over a period of time as your organization evolves. But maybe one other question that always comes to my mind, right? That what are some of the pointers that you can share so that your key trading partners can be part of your digital journey also? What is there for the CMOs to be part of this digital journey? I mean, I get it for a company, a branded or a generic or even a clinical phase. They have their own reasons. It could be launch time, launch quantities, getting the right product on time, and lowering the inventory cost or write-offs. But then, what is the motivation for the CMOs to play ball with these brand owners to be part of this digitalization journey?
I think it needs to be a win-win. That's the key thing. So if you're able to propose something to a trading partner or a CMO that helps them do their business better, right? What you don't want to do is have a win-lose relationship where, listen, I'm getting all this information out, but you're not getting anything. You're only getting me, not bothering you about this. So that may not be enough for them to commit the funds to. Because think about it, if you're a CMO, I may only have one CMO for drug substance, and maybe I have two. The CMO has 100 customers. So if 100 customers come to them and they ask for something different that's outside of their standard process, it's harder for them to do. I mean, within pharma, we're governed by SOPs, right? We don't have a choice. We have to go by the standard operating procedures. If you're
Correct.
changing something for one client, right, maybe you need to change it for others. And that becomes tricky when you're dealing with multiple processes. It can lead to a lot of issues within those CMOs. And this is just my opinion, not what anybody has said, right?
Yep.
So you really need to make it a win-win and be able to say, have this value statement where you're able to say, listen, this is what it does for you in my mind, and this is what it does for me, and it makes this relationship stronger. So if you're talking forecast, right? Forecast is always wrong. No matter what you do, no matter where you are, your forecast is incorrect. So, maybe the value proposition is if you're changing things around on a monthly basis, because let's say, for instance, you have a tender, or in generics, you have a new RFP, you have this big new demand coming in, and then all of a sudden it goes away, and then it comes back because you're linked in to your partner's website. Or their reporting, whether it's an API or it's an EDI, however that feed's coming in, you're getting mixed signals and you're sending those mixed signals on, so there's no filter in between, right? So maybe that's something where you say, listen, this is a problem that digitization has created. So how do we solve that problem, right? How do we put something in place that now changes that? Because now all of a sudden you're not getting these crazy forecasts from us, and we're able to better look at them, diagnose kind of where the challenges are, smooth them out as necessary, and then provide them to you rather than a straight flow through. So, those are type of things where you look at and you say, this is something that can help improve you and all the changes that your planners have to make on an ongoing basis, the reservation of capacity, the movement of batches in and out. Maybe it's even, if you're a DP vendor and you need vials, and all of a sudden the demand shoots up, and you're looking for 200 times the vials that you're expecting, you go ahead and place the order with the lead time, whatever else, to get what you need, and then the vendor comes back, or the customer comes back and says, "Oh, I don't need that anymore." Right? So it creates a lot of chaos. So I think making sure that you've identified the problem, and then also in relation to that, that you've provided a solution and say, listen, I think this is going to solve the problem, but I need you to be on board as well because we're going to change the process. So, you have, again, you have a CMO that has, it's a many to one relationship with you, and maybe you're a one to one relationship with them. So you need to get them on board, make sure that they're in tune with what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what is the value proposition, what problem does it solve for you.
Thanks, Colby. You almost keep reading my mind because it ties to one of the follow-up questions I was going to ask. And one of the things that always keeps bothering me is that if you look at the clinical phase organizations, right, they for almost all the cases they don't have enough production capacity to ramp up the production themselves, so they are heavily relying on their CMOs to get the product in time to the market, and that almost necessitates the clinical phase organizations to have a very strategic relationship with some of their key CMOs. Now, do you believe that the supply chain digitalization can act as a bridge to help establish this strategic relationship between the clinical phase organizations and their CMOs?
It's a tough question, actually, because I don't know that it can fill that bridge. I think it depends upon the organizations you're talking about. Typically when you're a clinical organization, you're not using full-fledged commercial manufacturers, right? You haven't necessarily made that transition. So the organizations you're using, maybe it's for label pack, maybe it's for DP filling, whatever it may be. Yeah, they're within the industry. Maybe they're not as far along or is not as advanced as some of the huge CMOs that you're dealing with. So I see it would add value there, right? I think when you're getting into that portion of commercialization where you're looking at higher volumes and you're looking at more movement within your supply chain and a lot more complexity, we'll say, I think then it becomes more difficult. You're a small fish in a big pond at that point. So we talked a little bit earlier about that relationship, right? When you're a smaller organization, bringing people along for the journey and making sure that they're engaged and that they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. We've had a lot of success just in making sure, and this just isn't at Dyne, it goes throughout my work history. The more you bring people along for the journey, and it's not transactional, so the more you're able to make connections with the other supply chain professionals, the other CMOs, whatever it may be, however you want to define them, that relationship is really what's going to drive the ability to get things done. And when you're talking about digitization, you're talking about a wholesale change to the way they do business. Maybe it's not huge, but it's a change. And typically, these organizations are not the fastest. They're not agile. Being clinical, you're agile. You have a small amount of people you need to get through. You don't need to. I can walk into the CEO's office and say, "Hey, listen, this is what I need," and he'll generally tell me no. But I can do that, and we can have that dialogue at the very top level. You can't do that when you're managing $1 billion budget and you're 4 levels from the top or 5 levels from the top. I mean, it just takes time. It's the red tape you have to go through in a large organization to be able to make that happen. So in a clinical organization, I can say, listen, if I'm working with a small supplier and I'm able to do something that makes their life easier because they only have 10 clients or 10 customers, whatever you want to call them, then I can do that. And I have the ability to kind of get through to them, right? But it's how big are you? How big are they? A lot of different factors play into it. But the number one thing I would say is, make it a relationship-based relationship, right? It's trust-based. It's making sure that you're following up, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and don't make it transactional. They're your partners, and if you want them to help you, they need to understand why they should. So if I'm going to stock out on something, I'm going to go to them and I'm going to say, hey, listen, I'm going to stock out. This is going to impact patients. It's going to impact, these DMD patients who are, they're not even teenagers yet. So making sure that they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. You have this strong culture within your organization, both as a large pharma and a small pharma, clinical stage company or not. You typically have this, this feeling within the organization that you're driving all towards the same goal, and you really want to accomplish these things. Take that to the supplier. I don't want to call them an employee of yours, right? But they're a partner, and they need to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why they should help. You can't just go there and say, hey, listen, this is what I need. That doesn't work. You need to give them the why. And
Yes.
everybody within the walls of your building has the why, right? You all know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Outside, they may not. They may not have ever had any interaction with the indications you're working with in rare disease and orphan drugs. Yeah, cancer touches everyone. Duchenne's doesn't touch a lot of people, right? So somebody who knows somebody, and I can give you a good example of this, right? So we were at one of our partners at one point in time, and we were talking very, very high level. We didn't really even bring supply chain into it. It was more, this is what we are, this is who we are, and this is what we're doing and why we want to do it. And some people in the room were even saying, no, I absolutely get it. Listen, my cousin's son has this disease, or they've faced these challenges. And you're able to really just kind of understand and bring them on board to say, listen, let's be partners. It's not transactional for us. It's more about what can we get done for the patients, and that's really what it comes down to. And that's why we're all doing what we're doing within pharma is for the patients, right?
Yeah.
To make lives better is really what it comes down to.
Yeah. No. I think the what and the why aspects are very important in this perspective. So you gave a very very clear view of how that can work. So maybe, I mean, for the rest of the time, what I would like to also do is go a little more tactical and understand a few things. I mean, to start off with, right? For example, can you maybe elaborate how does the supply chain digitalization work in tandem with the related business processes? Meaning, during the life cycle, would you imagine that you would be focusing on different type of business processes from a digitalization perspective? Meaning, starting with forecast exchange to start off with your CMOs, then maybe at some point go to your big four P2P transactions versus at a point where you are sharing net requirements. So, how does that evolve? If you can give some insights on that, that would be super in terms of a clinical phase organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on where you're starting from, right? So, I mean, again, it comes down to clinical phase. Maybe you're if you want to put it in the supply chain maturity model, whatever you want to call it, maybe you're phase 1, 2, and you're going from essentially nothing to internal alignment. So, when you're doing that, and you're trying to align internally, both with finance, with the clinical group, with the internal tech ops organization, manufacturing, and or external supply, however you want to look at it. You're really at this point where you need to align internally. That's the first phase, because really when you're in maturity model 1, it's everything is separate. Nothing is kept in one place. You don't necessarily everything, but maybe it's not memorialized on any documentation, and you don't have it where you can refer back to it, and you can actually share that with others. So as you start to transition into more of a mature organization, right, you're aligning internally, and the processes themselves mature with that. So you're going to have an SOP early on for a business process. Maybe it's a work instruction that's going to say, listen, you go into Excel, you do 1, 2, and 3. What's going to happen is, as you start moving into a phase 2 organization, that internal alignment, maybe you're starting on an S&OP process, right? So sales and operation planning. Maybe you're starting on demand reviews. Maybe you're working on supply reviews. You're getting that internal alignment. As you start to move really towards, the phase 3, you're looking more towards being able to provide those forecasts externally. How do you provide them? That's really up to the organizations. So whether you're doing it via EDI and you're transacting it, but keep in mind you're gonna get into a situation where you have to evolve because the contracts that you're signing mean that you have to evolve. So you're gonna have a situation where you're going to come into the window of binding, right? So you're gonna have binding forecasts to your suppliers. You're gonna have to provide a binding and unbinding forecast for maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 4 years. It depends on what the specific terms are, but you're going to have to be able to tell them and bind yourself financially to it. And when you start doing that, the processes evolve very quickly, right? Because you're now on the hook. You have to set that money aside, and you have to be able to pay your suppliers for what you're saying you were asking them to do. So the processes themselves start to evolve with it. So in a way, if you're working with fairly mature CMOs and more commercial CMOs, you're starting to get that maturity from them. And you're
Mhm.
starting to understand what you need to do. And how you choose to do it is up to you internally. So whether or not you choose to continue to use Excel, whether or not you choose to send it via EDI, right? If you don't necessarily have an ERP system, maybe you're not sending it via EDI. Maybe it has to be through Excel, unless there's another solution. But you're going back through and you're double checking the numbers that you have against your budget. You're checking them against your demand and what your demand is. Clinical, your demand is pretty flat, right? So you know how many patients you're going to enroll, you know the general timeline you're going to enroll them, phase 1, 2, and then into phase 3. You have these plans up front so you can start to build for them. If you're talking about your actual supply chain length, right? So how long is your supply chain? If your supply chain is 6 months long from linearly speaking, if you're 6 months, okay, then I need to know 6 months ahead of time. Maybe my binding window is a year. So all of a sudden, I need a year's worth of binding. I can generally understand what that is, right? Because it's flat. You're not enrolling additional patients. They're not taking more unless there's escalations involved, and you already have those planned out. So you know when that's going to happen. If you're in a commercial organization, if you're in a generic organization, branded is pretty flat. You can see the curve relatively easily, like how you build when you get to maturity, and then kind of what the drop off is. Very rarely are you surprised based on the market research that you've already done. When you're in generics, it's quite different, right? So again, it's commoditized. You have forecasts that go up and down. You're constantly trying to chase them. So I mean, I think again, as you're working through in clinical phase, you're really allowing yourself the space to build these processes to run along with the systems that you're using. Because again, if you're gonna bring in a new system, you need to have the processes behind it, right? So you're going to need to have that formalized process. You're going to need to know what your KPIs are because you're going to be held accountable for them. It's very different when you're in a small organization. Maybe it's an R&D organization, and you don't have that, right? You just need to know: did I get the batch that I asked for, and
Correct.
is it before I needed it? Those are the things that you're looking for, right?
Yeah. No, no, that's very aptly put, and I think what I'm realizing is this discussion can pretty much go on for forever, and we can keep talking about these challenges across the various type of organizations. But maybe to just close off a discussion, right? I want to just understand that if an organization was able to achieve complete digital integration with their key trading partners, let's say with their CMOs, what could be the top three improvement areas that you think they can achieve if they're able to get to that point? And maybe I know they could be different for a branded versus generic versus a clinical phase, but maybe you can give some insights on what could be the top three areas of improvement that these type of organizations can see in their operations.
Yeah, I mean, I think for all the organizations, really, when you get down to it, right? I don't know that there's ever a time where you can call it complete digital integration, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know of any organization, in all honesty, that's what I would consider like level 5 of supply chain, right? There's a few, but at that point you're using like AI. So I don't know that there's a complete digitization that takes place.
Yeah.
I think it's a process because not only are your processes evolving, right? But what type of technology is out there is evolving too. Think back, 25, 30 years, or even back to the 70s, right? So, SAP didn't exist in the 70s. Nobody could fathom what SAP would bring, right? It's real time, which is why it was R1, right? They named it R1 because of real time. So you're getting this information flow in real time, and you wouldn't have thought that before. There was always a delay. There was always a lag. So from that, I don't know that anyone would have conceptualized AI 30 years ago or 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, right? I mean, if you think of that digital evolution and our use of technology and how we're working with it, right? I'm one of like 3 people that carries an iPad to take my notes in the office. So, again, there's a point in time where you just have to say, listen, I'm going to evolve with it, and you have to be open to that. So that's the first piece of that. But I think as you go on this digitization journey, it's really formalizing your processes. It's making sure that you have a defined output. Like, what are you actually getting out of this? So if I'm going into this system, or I'm going into this process that involves some sort of digital, what am I getting out of it? How do I really check what I'm doing to make sure that it's worth it, right? Are people buying in? Maybe they're not. Are they using it? Are your KPIs getting better, or they're not? Did you define that out front? So that formalized process will help you understand what that outcome is, right? So that's number one. Because we're orchestrating outcomes, right? That's what it means. And number 2, it's agility. It's agility and being able to move with the market as the market requires, move with the organization as the organization requires, and being able to make changes as you need, right? If you run out of part A and you need part B, you need to be able to make that change.
Right.
Can you do it in the system, or does it take you a week to change the production versions in SAP to be able to do that? Or can you just do it in the BOM because you've structured it in such a way that it works? Or
Correct.
can your AI do that for you, right? Are they able to have that not only demand sensing, but also that supply sensing piece of
Yep.
it? Are you able to hands off be able to allow the system to do that? And do you want to? That's another question, right? That's a big question. But all in all, like the last thing I'll say is really, when you're talking about digitization, right? You're looking for better decision making. You're looking for that information that leads you to a better decision, an improvement. Maybe it's identification of new leading indicators, right? Because typically we all work off of a forecast, and that involves some historical component. You're not necessarily looking forward, and you're not looking at these leading indicators. So maybe, just maybe, when you start getting into digitization, you're looking at now uncovering something from this metadata that you have, right? You have this whole data lake that you can pull from. Maybe you know that you have the data, and maybe you don't. But maybe the digitization can help you determine what is that information that best defines your organization, that actually tells you what you need to do and how to do it, moving forward.
Yeah. No. And I think, right, I mean, one of the key things that you mentioned at the start of the conversation, that I don't think many have achieved that level of digital maturity. And I remember in one of our recent conversations internally, there was a number that was thrown up in one of, and I think it was maybe from a survey by Gartner, or from one of such industry leaders, where they said that only about 6% of the industry has any sort of end-to-end digital supply chain integration done. So you are very right in the sense that that's not something that has been achieved. But if we really were to able to get to that, I think agility and this being able to respond and react to all these disruptions or market changes in real time would be a telling improvement that we can see in the industry. And I'm really looking forward to that. Blue sky one day. But I guess I mean these conversations are really very close to my heart, and I can, as I said, keep talking about this. But as usual, time is not always on our favor, so I think we just need to wrap it up. But it was pleasure talking with you, Colby, on this orchestrating outcome series. I keep saying that this topic is very close to my heart, and I've lived through the spectrum of having little to no digital integration to having a very high level of integrations in some of the use cases. So we will stay in touch on this topic, and I hope to reconnect with you on this topic on a lot of our several upcoming events and or conversation where we get to talk about this. And I hope the industry evolves to embrace supply chain digitalization. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Orchestrating Outcomes. Stay tuned for more episodes as we try to bring in more leaders, industry leaders, both from the CMO brand owners and even from organizations that are spanning across a variety of these uh, uh, types, from generic to branded to clinical to small revenue to big revenue organizations. And hopefully their stories can inspire you to accelerate your own digital journey also. So thank you, and we'll meet again on the next episode.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.